everything is kind of propping up that authentic interaction if you're going to make a sale, and that's what we're going to be driving toward. So I wouldn't really recommend a best practice presentation format or proposal format, except that you want to be looking to, there's two factors that I would say to consider from, in terms of practical advice. One is a standard is only as much of a standard as you have the energy to sustain sending it out to everybody who asks for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I could give you the best practice sales template, but if it takes you an hour to make every one, and every time a lead comes in, you're like, oh my God, I have to do this again, then that's not a standard that's going to work for you, and it's irrelevant. So a lot of times especially as a small solopreneur or like starting a small consulting agency, you have to look at the intersection between your time to execute on proposal work and the ROI you get from it. And a lot of times that's going to dictate a sustainable place where your best practice should be, but that means it's going to be unique to you, because I can't look at a benchmark in the industry and say, Ellen, this is the one that you should be using for your service and for the people you want to serve. Because if you don't like doing it, it comes back to that self-assessment first. It doesn't matter, because you're going to send out one of them, and then your sales engine is going to grind to a halt, because you're not going to want to do that every time.
And I can't stress. Oh, sorry, Ellen.
I was just going to add to that. I think the way that I learn is understanding baselines, what people have tried before that has worked for them, and then allowing myself to be creative. Is that something that I want to adopt? How can I work that into my own energetic groove? And that's something that is going to work for me. But I definitely do learn by understanding, what are the processes that have worked for you in the past? Have you ever ran into issues where you were in this stage of negotiation, and what did you use? What kind of communication? What really worked? Did you pick up the phone? Did you ask to meet them for another coffee or a meal? And then going in and internalizing and thinking, is that something that I want to also adopt?
Yeah. Let me answer that directly. And Jonathan, I know you had a point. Well, you say your point first, Jonathan, then I want to respond to that, though.
I was just reacting to the authenticity, because the authenticity is what makes something sustainable. A lot of people say, they look at these gurus who pump them up, and how to sell a pen, or, whatever it is, like how to sell. And yes, that could be impressive. And, you see a presentation, it says like, oh, I want to be like that. But it's not sustainable, because in order for that to be done, you need to become someone else or someone you're not. And that is always a very tough scenario to sustain over any length of time. And we also don't know how us being us is going to be very authentic. I remember a big pitch I did where there was a group that came out, and they just looked super confident and sharp. And when I went in, for whatever reason, I got nervous about the moment. And at the end, we won. And it was because they saw my nervousness as respect. I didn't seem cocky. I seemed authentic. And I would have said that was my worst pitch, and we were up against people I thought, looked like they pitched amazing. So we don't know, but I could tell you, if you're always just showing up present, that you could always do. That's easy to do. And you can't judge if it's success or failure. But if you're trying to show up as somebody else or something else, that is very hard to do over time.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, just to answer your direct question about it, I understand the want to like what's other people's best practices so you can adopt to yourself, or you can adapt to yourself. So I'll tell you a little bit about mine that I think will be relevant to you as sort of a, selling consulting services on a solo basis. I think the biggest thing for me is the best practice about what materials should you have. You should always have a portfolio that I think is client confidential and highlights the work you're most proud of, and something that you don't need to edit for each presentation. For me, best practice comes about replicability and reducing your cost of process. So that means you don't want to be expecting to do a bespoke proposal for every client, and you only want to be putting yourself there if you really need to. So I have several things that I would want to have in my tool set. You want to have your best practice portfolio, but small, just highlighting some of your best work that you could say, here's some of the example of what it will look like working with me in like a generic basis. You'll want to have like a basic presentation about what your service is. But again, thinking about like a 90% standard core that is you centric, that's talking about you and what you are as a person and like why they would want to speak to you. Because if you're talking about why they should buy in this particular instance, or they ask you a ton of questions up front about like, what are you going to do for me? What is this? What is that? And they're not even willing to talk to you. I find as a best practice in my experience as a consultant that those are leads that are not worth the ROI of converting them is usually not worth it. And even if you can, it's going to be a rough ride. So really everything you build should be supplemental to you being able to get on the phone with them. And a lot of times that means pitches are really just as much as here's who I am, here's what establishes credibility. So like look at those as two pillars, the who you are piece. So you really can talk about who you are and why should you listen to me? Like what is some establishment of credibility that could either be past clients, like I said, work portfolio, whatever it is, that you're not just coming off the street. And then the third thing is anything communication wise or presentation wise that's going to encourage them to talk to you and have an open conversation. So you don't want to have ever like, what are my best practice materials? It's the ones that I've found over the years that are going to help me get somebody on the phone with me as fast as possible with as little bit of as investment as possible.